Hello and welcome. My name is Austin Carlson, and today I'm going to present my senior thesis. Throughout the progression of this assignment and the generation of my thesis as a whole, I found myself witnessing many reflections between the dystopian world observed in Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and the world I call my home. This world I find myself in is limited, and while the setting may be different, many of the reflections and the criticisms they call echo in my own life. The process of developing my thesis has been a challenging one, and I would be remiss to say that it has been anything other than incredibly enjoyable. To reckon with the fears I hold about the future that lays before me, and the fears that will inevitably face me as my life progresses through this world. And the addition of an eco-critical perspective has afforded me the ability to understand the ways that the natural world I find myself in stands to influence the way that I think about what I interact with on a day-to-day basis. And one thing that I find myself choosing when I wake up is violence. There's a power behind it. There's a way that violence allows me to get through my day which is unparalleled by emotions like love or sadness or awe. And to some level, in spite of its controversial nature, I believe that violence is a fundamental part of my perspective as an American. And this will likely never change as my imperial nation pioneers the constructions of death each and every day. Through these constructions of death and the changes and infractions to human rights enacted on the labor class every single day in the pursuit of convenience, I am forced to reckon with it in no other way than violence. And today came just like any other. I woke up in a panic, frenzied state from a nightmare all too real. I laid in bed for a while until I felt the violence take over my body. And then I took from it the power to carry myself through another day. Another day of madness, another day of paranoia and fear among men and women. I was greeted by beautiful blue skies and the warm faces of people who care for me. And in such, the violence I met the world with forced me to grow, forced me to look past the anger and frustration of rising again to the same monotonous trial. And I was afforded a grand new perspective, one which stands elevated. Through this elevation, I am forced to question that which exists before me. In this natural world, where the benefits and draws of convenience vastly outweigh the individual's care for one another, we are left only with reasonable excuses to stop the work day, another 2-week-long quarantine, another year in your house, another excuse to tattle on one another. And all we are left with at the end of this is each other and the world we will leave behind. This world, wrought with the destruction of industrialization and the continued pursuit of upward progression at the cost of these valuable things which do not hold monetary value, but instead the value of a soul, which could never truly be quantified. The death and destruction lingering in the wake of our constant upward growth is only a beginning to the directions we shall pioneer into the future. To preface the introduction of my analysis of the role of violence in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, I should first introduce the setting in which the story takes place. In a near future West Coast, World War terminus has rendered the Earth a hellscape. Environmental disaster, ecological death and destruction, unparalleled in our time, exists as a fact of life for Rick Deckard, the protagonist of the story. We are introduced to Deckard as he fights with his wife. In a petty sort of argument, they roll over round and round, trying to one-up one another in the sorts of ways that come about when you're forced to live so close to someone you love. From the perspective inside Deckard's head, we are afforded a glance into a trial he faces. An apparatus which allows him to directly control his emotional responses has coded indexes by which he can administer happiness, anger, adrenaline, frustration, fear, paranoia, sadness, or madness. And whilst he fights with his wife, we are introduced to an inner monologue in which he debates whether or not he should administer a degree of complacency so he can accept her perspective and move on, or if he ought to administer anger so he can one-up her once more. She coolly replies that if she meets his frustration with more anger on his part, then she shall only up the ante. And Deckard retreats. This violence and its casual introduction within the very first few paragraphs of the short story stand as an introduction into the emotional compass of our main character. For Deckard, emotions are nothing more than numbers to be punched into a box, something to control, just like the earth around him is controlled by the environmental disaster which faces it. This environmental disaster and the uninhabitable nature of most of Earth's land mass within the time the story is set bred a necessity for progression into the multiverse. We are afforded a glance into the setting through the role of androids. Androids function as industrial machinery to be utilized as a means to an end at a continued profit. There are direct comparisons to be made to slavery. Unlike enslavement, in which a peoples are dominated for their labor capacity, the androids are created with the explicit intention of serving the labor force of humanity. The androids go off into space colonies, to planets which are largely uninhabitable for human life, to pioneer settlements by which the human species can progress. After the wanton destruction of the earth we all call home, it came about as a necessity, so as to assure our destruction would not be faced. And in such, androids are all born unto the same fate, to die enslaved to the hand which created them. As many of you may imagine, this fate is not one which many androids are willing to accept. In the face of sure rebellion, the humans conceived of only one reasonable response to a living, breathing, thinking individual's dire pleas for ownership over their own lives. The humans responded by dehumanizing the androids. Rick Deckard retires Andes. This is the language by which Philip K. Dick communicates the normalization of violence and the dehumanization of androids therein. The Voight-Kampff test, which is the vehicle by which androids are found in their natural environment when they have escaped from captivity and enslavement, determines that the android's empathic response is artificially generated. Unlike a human who has natural instinctual empathy as a response to any sort of emotionally demanding situation, the android functions its brain as a process of calculation, similar to a computer. Rick Deckard, our intrepid protagonist, has a job which requires that he retire Andes. This is the language utilized to communicate the casual nature of the violence that exists within the narrative. Androids, like humans, have emotional responses to stimulus. As an effect of these emotional responses, androids are inclined to feel one type of way or another, to empathize, sympathize, and in some cases, hold apathetic responses to violence. Of course, being that androids are, in this universe, artificially produced, there is some question as to whether or not they're... I'm trying to work right now. This is my senior thesis and it's due very soon. Can you please stop whining? Coming off on my third take now, trying to get through the dogs barking and roommates howling late at night. And she's going to bark again in a moment, so you'll have to excuse it. But at this point, frankly, I think I'm over trying to have a perfect take. The importance of this project is to articulate the reflections of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep as it relates to the problems which face us in our everyday lives. Of course, the immediate analogy to slavery, which is brought about as an effect of Philip K. Dick's comparison of androids to enslaved peoples in the United States, is one that is a readily apparent comparison. Of course, a labor force that's emotions are largely diminished as an effect of their necessity and the necessity of their labor therein, is something that in our modern context we can recognize as immoral. Of course, within the time of slavery, this was regarded as just a natural byproduct of the capitalist structure that all people willingly participated in to afford themselves luxuries and conveniences and the like. From our modern remove, we can recognize that owning another human being is unethical and immoral. This does not diminish the significance of ownership of androids. Androids within the central narrative of the short story are basically functionally human beings. They have real emotional responses, they look like people, they talk like people, and for the most part they act like people. And in fact they act so much like people that they really don't like being enslaved very much. Due perhaps as an effect of the technological progression which afforded these artificial brains many of their processes, the androids are exceptionally good at evading capture, which is why Rick Deckard holds some necessity within the short story's universe as a whole. I'm really quite sorry that I saved this until the night before. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, I can recognize the importance of completing an assignment of this magnitude, perhaps before 2 hours before its due date. But I'm going to be taking 12 credit hours during the May term in order to just ensure that I can pass, because my financial aid is going to run out, and from there I won't be able to attend Hampton-Sydney any longer, and all the debt I've already gone into will be for naught. Sad to think that I'd throw it all on the line for the name of an institution which at the end of the day wouldn't even be willing to bend its back for me. But I suppose that's just an effect of my own mistakes, and nothing I can blame on anything other than myself. Lola, come here. Lola, come here. Look it up. Hello. Hello. Alright. So in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, there are some central questions which arose within my own understanding of the short story and the universe as a whole. And one of the biggest questions that I had was, does supposing an elite position over another living being warrant its destruction without emotion? And to build from this, I think it's important to recognize a quote from a notable game series, Fallout, in which, in the Honest Hearts DLC for Fallout New Vegas, there's a character named Joshua Graham. Now, Joshua Graham states, "I don't like killing, but when done righteously, it's a chore, like any other." Applied to the American understanding of violence and its function within our imperialist state, it's important to recognize that killing is a natural effect of all the benefits and luxuries and affordances that we all take so seriously and take for granted. I mean, I drive a car, and that car runs on oil. And where do we get oil? We get it from countries we occupy. And what do we do when we occupy the countries? We shoot people who don't like us being there. So we're killing, and we're killing for peace, and we're killing for cars. Now, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the killing is a little bit more understated. It's not necessarily communicated as murder, as, say, any other logical individual would perceive it as, but it's instead identified as retiring. The idea is androids exist exclusively to work, and when they're no longer working, then they get retired. Now, this is a relatively interesting conception about death, especially if you consider that most of our primary function as human beings is simply to serve the ruling class. It's important to recognize that the androids have legitimate empathic responses to all sorts of things. And although the Voight-Kampff test, which is the test by which androids are outed, as we might say, basically determines not whether or not they have an empathic response, but instead determines that they have an artificial empathic response. And so the human beings justify the indiscriminate destruction of basically a conscious life form that can recognize it's alive and have emotions relating to such, on the basis of the fact that its construction is artificially generated. Now, of course, this diminishes in its complexity when you start to wonder whether or not people with pacemakers or artificial organs are human, because of course they still are. And of course, even if your heart's made of metal, it's still a heart, and it still keeps you alive, and there's many more components which stand to lend some element of humanity. But if I was to guess, I'd probably say that being able to look at yourself and realize that you are you and you are alive is probably one of the most foundationally important parts to recognizing life. Lola, come here. Lola, come here. Please stop whining. Please be quiet. Please. So meeting emotionally demanding actions with empathy is something that Rick Deckard is forced to reckon with throughout the storyline. Now, in Blade Runner, which is the movie based off of the short story, ultimately the killing is at the forefront of the audience's attention. And in the introduction of the film, the killing is done so indiscriminately by an android that there's some element of villainization, I might say, where you look at this android and you figure, wow, out of nowhere, he shoots this guy. And now I'll be playing a clip from the movie. But I must ask if the destruction of living beings is morally destructive in combative situations. Now, I have a lot of friends who are in the armed forces, many of whom enlisted because it was easier than trying to go into debt for college, many of whom enlisted because it was a career path they hoped to find some sort of job security in, many of whom enlisted because they wanted to kill. But killing for our nation is killing nobly as far as our propaganda is concerned. And this is brought about by the kill or be killed nature of combat. Combat unto itself, or any situation which demands death as a natural reaction of some sort of confrontation, necessitates that the party unwilling to be stopped shall not be, and the party which accepts death shall die. It's an inevitable factor of life, one that's truly unavoidable. But when a cop is getting shot at and he kills his attacker, it's not viewed as destruction. It's viewed as part of the job. When a Marine infantryman kills someone who is shooting at him, it is often not perceived as murder, but an essential part of his function. Now, why is this? This is because the delineations between the individual and the state allow for moral ambiguity as it applies to violence. A perfect example of this can be observed in the death penalty. In states like Texas and Florida, if you kill someone, the state kills you. Now you get into the questions of why this is. It's simply because the state is so disgusted with your unconscionable act of violence that it warrants that the only proper response afforded to such violence is more violence. Now, while the logic of this perspective may be lost to me, I can understand why there is some appeal to the state in its totality determining who lives and who dies. And when some people do things so bad, sometimes it's natural to call for their destruction. But their destruction is still destruction, and it's still brought about by violence. And upon reflection, one must ask him or herself, what about this situation warrants apathy? In the universe of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the Voight-Kampff test is administered to determine whether or not an android who holds an artificial response to empathy or a human who holds an instinctual response to empathy, is deserving of death. Now, a human who's simply existing doing human things has nothing to worry about. But an android, whose empathy is artificially generated, will be killed on the spot. This functions as an effect of the apathy by which the main character, in this case, Deckard, is able to meet the empathy of another. The androids still have empathy. They still feel. But because of their supposed elite quality above androids, humans are able to dispatch of them in such a way that doesn't even require they use harsh words like kill, because androids are retired. In Django Unchained, there's an iconic sequence in which Django, the main character, whips a slave owner near to death. Of course, the moral implication behind this revenge is that because the slave owner is participating in an evil act through the ownership of a slave and the abuse of another human being therein, Django's actions are warranted and justified, in spite of their barbaric nature. Now I should ask, when witnessing violence, does it truly matter whether or not the victim is evil, or is it still violence just the same? In order to suppose any elite quality over another, one must first look within themselves. And upon reflection of the self, it's quite easy to look at others and figure where you're above them or where they're above you. But in some cases, the ways that we perceive social order are impacted by what we consume, and not any natural truths. Now, of course, slave ownership is evil. And of course, wishing death upon a slave owner as a slave is a natural response to being enslaved. But does any person deserve to be whipped to death? I know my answer, but perhaps the viewer should look within to find theirs. And in the instance that you find an absolute answer, I suggest that you reconsider, because there are ultimately more factors than any of us are privy to, which stand to influence whether or not it's right. This, of course, does not diminish from the entertainment value of such a sensational blockbuster as Django Unchained, nor does it diminish from the sensational action observed in Blade Runner, the film iteration of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? In the film, we are introduced to androids as they are being administered the Voight-Kampff test, and one android in particular, who upon being found out, reacts by shooting down his tester, the Blade Runner. This, of course, is violence that is unwarranted and demands that our protagonist, Rick Deckard, hunt down and kill these androids. Now, while it may be easy from our distance and remove to recognize the ways in which this violence is ultimately unwarranted, within the narrative of the film, Deckard is simply working a job, just like any other. It is not until the end of the movie, where Deckard is face to face with the main villain, a blonde android whose name escapes me in this moment, that the monologue he witnesses firsthand from the android upon his deathbed forces in some capacity a reflection on the violence being enacted so casually. I will now play a clip exhibiting this sequence. Such a chilling moment, unparalleled in cinema's history. And finally, to include an example of violence as it exists within the story itself, I will be reading an excerpt from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? He stood alone in the empty hall. Mercer had left him because he had done what he came for. Rachel, or rather Pris Stratton, had been dismembered, and that left nothing now, only himself. But elsewhere in the building, Batsy waited and knew, perceived what he had done here, probably at the point they were afraid. This had been their response to his presence in the building. Their attempt, without Mercer, it would have worked for them. Winter had come. This has to be too quickly, and what I'm after now, he realized. He hurried down the hall and all at once his detection gear registered the presence of cephalic activity. He had found their apartment. No more need of the gear. He discarded it and rapped on the apartment door. From within, a man's voice sounded. "Who is it?" "This is Mr. Isidore," Rick said. "Let me in because I'm looking after you and two of you are women." "We're not opening the door," a woman's voice came. "I want to watch Buster Friendly on Pris's TV set," Rick said. Now that he's proved Mercer doesn't exist, it's very important to watch him. I drive a truck for the Van Ness Pet Hospital, which is owned by Mr. Hannibal Sloat. He made himself stammer. So would you open the door?" "It's my apartment." He waited and the door opened. Within the apartment he saw darkness and indistinct shapes, two of them. The smaller shape, the woman said, "You have to administer tests." "It's too late," Rick said. The taller figure tried to push the door shut and turn on some variety of electronic equipment. "No," Rick said. "I have come in." He let Roy Batty fire once. He held his own fire until the laser beam had passed by him and he twisted out of the way. "You've lost your legal basis," Rick said, "by firing on me. You should have forced me to give you the Voight-Kampff test, but now it doesn't matter." Once more, Roy Batty sent a laser beam cutting at him. Missed, dropped the tube, and ran somewhere deeper inside the apartment. To another room, perhaps. The electronic hardware was abandoned. "Why didn't Pris get you?" Miss Batty said. "There is no Pris," he said. "Only Rachel Rosen," over and over again. He saw the laser tube in her dimly outlined hand. Roy Batty had slipped it to her, and had meant to decoy him into the apartment far in, so that Irmgard Batty could get him from behind in the back. "I'm sorry, Miss Batty," Rick said, and shot her. Roy Batty in the other room let out a cry of anguish. "Okay, you loved her," Rick said, "and I loved Rachel. And the special loved the other Rachel." He shot Roy Batty. The big man's corpse lashed about, toppled like an overstacked collection of separate brittle entities. It smashed into the kitchen table and carried dishes and flatware down with it. Reflex circuits in the corpse made it twitch and flutter, but it had died. Through such, we are forced to reckon with the raw power and true tragedy of an android's existence within their time. The power is observed, of course, in their ability to be free even in death. And their tragedy is observed, of course, in the function of their creation, which affords them no humanity, and in such, no dignity in death. It is quite easy from an elevated perspective to look at the violence being enacted upon androids within the central narrative as something we are all above. Of course, it's simple enough to look to violence and declare that you are elevated beyond its, how would we say in this instance, constant prevalence. But at the end of the day, there are not too many differences between the world we are faced with now and the world that Philip K. Dick chillingly creates in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Through World War Terminus and its large-scale environmental destruction, humans are forced not to reckon with their role in nature and the innate respect that ought to be afforded to all living things on the basis of the fact that they are simply living. But instead, they are forced to look to their future in constant hopes of progression. The necessity of a complacent workforce is essential for them. The necessity of a complacent workforce in our modern age is more prevalent than ever, with companies like Tesla utilizing child labor in Africa to mine the minerals utilized for their energy-efficient car batteries, and companies like Apple utilizing slave labor in China in order to more effectively produce higher margins for their low-quality products. It should come as no secret that the rights of the individual are often infringed upon for the convenience of the many. Now, I own an iPhone, and I drive a car which runs off of gasoline, and as I stated before, and will continue to state into my future, the American imperial occupation of the Middle East exists exclusively to kill for oil. And every day that I drive my car and fill it up with gas, I am forced to reckon with that death and destruction. As it has existed throughout history and will continue to exist into the eons that will follow me, and in such, I am forced to question the ethics of these things which I hold so dearly. If there is no serious empathic response to witnessing large-scale violence every day, because it is simply more convenient for us to ignore it, are we truly better than those who we demonize? And while I may be speaking purely in speculation, I think there is something at least moderately noble in the ability to face your destruction head-on, as the androids do. Because rather than live enslaved, they choose to die, hunted like animals. But they die free. In conclusion, there are many facets by which we quantify that which exists around us and the moral implications of all the conveniences we are afforded. It is no secret that the many benefits of the lifestyles we afford are brought about by violence and wanton destruction. And in reckoning with that violence, we are forced to engage with it in the ways that it stands to influence us. I think that if you allow a supposed elite quality to dictate the degree by which you empathize with the suffering of another, then you are truly no better than that which you deem evil. And in the face of adversity, in the face of violence, in the face of stupidity, ignorance, and general dumbness, we are all obligated, as human beings capable of empathy, to engage with each other as people, with the same degrees of respect and understanding we would hope to have afforded to us. Any sort of quandary utilized to justify the violence being enacted on any living thing is ultimately a moot point, as violence only begets more violence, and to justify it we must forget exactly what makes us human, at least by the standards of what Philip K. Dick quantifies, or qualifies, in his short story, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It is precisely this empathy that warrants humans the right to live and androids the judgment to die. And through this empathy, I am forced to question, what gives cause, right, or reason to any man to take another's life? There is no answer I can fathom, but in its relation to our times, it is now more important than ever to understand the duty we all have to appeal to those empathic emotions, to those fears, sadnesses, happiness, and anger that makes us all human. And to suppose that whatever thing we are feeling is smaller than how important it is for all of us to get along together. If we are not able to do this, all that will face us is more polarization, more violence, more death, and more destruction. And as hopeful as I am, for a future that will be removed from such evil, barbaric deeds, I am also apprehensive in our collective ability to adapt in a way that truly fosters emotional intelligence and growth. As a final note, I would like to thank Dr. Eric Klein and Dr. Perry and Dr. Hardy, who were all essential in giving me feedback about the directions of my arguments and the ways in which I could bolster my points in order to effectively convey a more concise message through this. I have been blessed by the opportunity to study under each and every one of you, and am truly humbled by the growth I have witnessed within myself in such a short amount of time, to think that what lies ahead of me is only more.